Thank you, everybody. So we wanted to put together a presentation to tell you a little bit about the journey that we've been on, really thinking about our customer journey in an entirely new way, and bringing the emotional experience of working with Thomson Reuters into that whole marketing kind of dynamic. I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about why we even decided to do it in the first place. And then I'm going to hand over to Simon, who is part of Omo Bono, who's the agency we worked with, who'll talk to you a little bit about the process. What did we actually do? Because I think it's helpful when you come to these things to come away with some sense of, OK, well, if I wanted to do that, what would be the things that I would need to start to get going on in order to make that happen? And then lastly, both of us will touch on some insights that we got out of the process and some kind of ingredients that we thought were pretty critical to make this successful. So about 18 months ago, I bought an Alexa. And when I got my Alexa, obviously Amazon know more about me than my husband does, and they pretty much know that I am a mother of 2 children, I live in North London, and I was going to put the Alexa in my kitchen. Of course, I got the onboarding emails and the helpful Alexa app. But the next time I went onto Amazon to buy something, I was automatically on a pilot for Amazon Fresh, which is their food delivery service. And that made me stop and think, do we at Thomson Reuters recognize the moment when a customer becomes a customer? Do we adapt and flex our channels to service that? And I was really excited about getting an Alexa, and I was curious, therefore. I was in a good mindset for them to start to upsell me into something else. And were we really thinking about those moments of opportunity where actually we're surprising a customer, delighting a customer, or changing the paradigm in order to sell them something else? And the answer, frankly, was no. So that was the first kind of catalyst that made us start to think about, could we be doing this differently? And of course, B2B marketing is different from B2C marketing. But in some ways, you could argue that the emotional experience is actually more important rather than less. Firstly, you have a much longer relationship, typically, or you can do, certainly contractually with Thomson Reuters. Some of our customers have been customers of ours for decades, if not hundreds of years. Often you're buying on behalf of somebody else. And what that means is that if I'm buying on behalf of Simon, it's going to be really important to me that Simon feels good about that decision. And it's going to be really important to me at the point at which that kind of risk and that decision's taken, that I can feel very, very good about the decision that I've made. And that is an emotional feeling. It's, as we heard about first thing this morning, there's a rational component to it, but in the main, it's a kind of an emotional feeling. And often in B2B marketing, we service this with information, and we send a lot of information through about what we like to work with and how to use our products. But a recent CEB survey said that actually too much information is 18% less likely to help somebody make a decision. It kind of paralyzes the decision-making process. Lastly, often when we're doing B2B marketing, we're selling quite expensive things. And if you're selling expensive things, it can be a career-making or breaking decision. And frankly, there's very little that's less emotional than that. If your livelihood, your status, your pay, your well-being is on the line, that's a pretty emotionally intense decision. And I think as B2B marketers, we don't necessarily always recognize that, especially if we're selling something complicated and expensive. The last piece of kind of science that went into our thinking of this was that when you start to look at what it is that people remember about an experience of you as a company, they remember the best, the worst, and the last interaction that they had with you. And actually, even in a really long buying cycle, they don't remember the kind of average of it. If you ask people 6 months, a year later, they remember the best, the worst, and the last. And again, that caused us to stop and think, do we use that information, plus all the data that we know about our customers, to really think about how we're marketing to them? Or do we help to just maintain a status quo through that buying cycle because we think it's important to keep communicating? But is that actually the best use of our time and effort? So just before we go into the kind of meat of the presentation and what we did, just a little bit of an explanation about Thomson Reuters. So we provide news, information, so data, analytics, and tools that power the financial services industry. We have corporate clients too, but the main bulk of our business is in financial services. Commercially, we have a huge, eclectic range of products, right from things that cost multiple millions of pounds and that are pieces of infrastructure that will be inside the bank for tens of years, right through to things that are really quite cheap and you can buy for a few £100s on a kind of once-off basis. So we have a very varied commercial relationship with our customers. Also, in the financial services industry, you have a very vast range of personalities. Now, that's probably true of all industries, but in financial services, if you look at the type of person who becomes a trader versus the type of person who becomes a compliance manager, you're really looking at a very, very different type of individual in terms of motivation for going to work, in terms of what content they want to receive and the depth of it, in terms of the time span and the minutes of the day that they'll give you. So we feel like we have quite an interesting job because we do have this huge breadth of personalities within the group of people that we market to. So we knew what we wanted to do, but we felt like we needed to work hard at thinking about how we were going to get there. And there were three pretty fundamental things that we did. Firstly, we reorganized as a marketing organization. So where my team before had been aligned to product sets effectively, and we'd been mapped to the business and the way that we went to market with the business, we reorganized ourselves and so we were aligned to customer types. So now, rather than having a group of people who look after investing and advisory, we have people who look after trading, or people who look after risk, or people who look after bankers. So we sent a very kind of clear message to ourselves and to the business that we were really putting the customer at the heart of the way that we were going to work as a marketing function. The second thing that we did is when we started to put together our marketing plans for the year, we really, really sanity checked them against some of those personality types and stereotypes that I was talking about before. So we really, rather than kind of do a bit of a rollout and repeat of the plan, we really tested ourselves to say, if we're aligned to a customer segment type, and we know quite a lot about that type, does our marketing activity really live up to what we know about? And the third thing is we had a huge opportunity because we decided to kind of re-platform our entire website. And that kind of gave us a catalyst moment for really rethinking how it was that we were going to show up to customers as part of that experience. So I'm going to hand over to Simon now, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about the process that we went through and how particularly, specifically, that rolls out on the website. And then I'm going to take it back and talk to you about kind of what else we did outside the web project.
Great, thank you, Antonia. So we were given this vision by Antonia and her team, a very ambitious vision, creating this consistent experience, putting brand at the heart of it. And Antonia's a very persuasive person, so we went about trying to find out how to deliver on this. And what do you actually do? How do you actually put customer feelings right at the heart of a design process? I want to talk you through this approach and just touch on a few of the different processes we went through to try and really understand how we understood what the customer was feeling at different stages. The first thing we did actually was we started in the best place that all strategies should start, which is with research. So we started looking at what data we had available to us right now to understand customer behavior. And from that, we can start to understand where pain points might lie, things that weren't working so well, things that were. And we looked at all sorts of things from website analytics to marketing campaigns to existing customer research, user experience testing, a whole bunch of data that basically allowed us to start building a picture from what we had of what the customer was currently experiencing. The next thing we started to do was to build up personas. And I want to talk a bit about personas because personas are very interesting. We had 9 customer segments to work with from Antonia and her team. We used those as a basis for our personas. We tweaked them slightly to incorporate some behaviors and different relationships. And then we basically built up documentation that allowed us to see at a glance what sort of customer we were dealing with, what their goals were, what their motivations were, what their technical literacy was, what their experience in the industry was, and also looking at what frustrations they faced and the opportunities that might be available to them. These became these benchmarks for all our decision making as we went through the project. The next thing we did was we started to look at building cross-functional teams around each of these personas. So we built teams who included people from marketing, from sales, from customer service, innovation. And what we wanted to do is get these people in a room and map out what they thought the journey might look like. So we got that kind of wide-ranging view from around the business of what actually a customer experience might be. And from these processes, from these workshops, we started to develop these, which were customer experience maps. And these became the kind of blueprint for what we saw as the customer journey right the way through the experience. So we started at each stage, we'd looked at discovery stage, consideration, approval, purchase. It depended actually on the persona what those steps were. And we started breaking that down into what are the touch points that that persona was interacting with, what are the actions they're taking, what questions might they have at each stage in the process, but also what barriers are there, what frustrations they face, and crucially, how are they feeling at each step. And you can see on here this sort of red and orange line that you see in the background at the bottom. That's actually a kind of a feelings chart. It says high, low, what might that feeling be. And this allowed us to really play into points where we felt there was friction, and where people might be feeling in a negative way about their experience, but also to really accentuate those areas where the brand was doing really well. The next thing we did, of course, was we wanted to test this with customers, real customers in interview situations. Have we got this right? Is our hypothesis about what the customer journey like actually matching reality? So we conducted a number of customer interviews to really use a series of really probing questions to start to understand, is our view of what the customer experience, is that actually accurate? And what have we missed? What areas could we be still complementing our data with? One thing we found this really helpful for actually was to prioritize opportunities. So we'd started to develop some hypotheses about what the final solution might actually look like, but of course we wanted to test where priorities might lie given that we were sort of under time constraints, as you always are in a project. The final thing we did then was to create these user scenarios, and this is when we're taking the large customer experience down into what that actually means for a website project. So of course our website would touch the customer experience at multiple different stages all the way through. And customers would be using it in different ways at each of those stages. Sometimes they're looking for information, sometimes they're actually trying to compare our products with competitors, and sometimes they might be trying to contact customer support. In total, we identified about 27 different potential journeys with different trigger points. And these user scenarios just map out each of those journeys step by step. We start to break it down. What do they do? What's their first step? They go to Google. The second step, they land on this page, and so on and so forth. And we were able to then build content plans into each of those steps. What content does someone need at each step to bring them through to the next stage? And this starts to get us into a position where we start to develop a content strategy, information architecture, the user experience strategy, and so on. So this was the process we undertook. It was multiple different stakeholders. It was quite rigorous and intensive. We developed so many great insights off the back of this process, and we're going to share 3 with you today, which we thought would be really interesting and relevant. And I'm going to talk about 2 of them, and I'll pass back to Antonia for the final one. The first one was this, and this might be something that a number of you feel if you sell big, complex products to big, complex organizations, is that personas weave a complex dance with each other. And this is something that we kind of intuitively knew but hadn't really seen until we mapped out those customer journeys. That actually personas are interdependent on one another all the way through the journeys. There's points at which someone's a buyer, then they're an influencer. There's points at which somebody might be identifying a solution and then having to validate that solution with someone who's a user. These different types of relationships are so important. And so when we started to build the website solution, we could understand when someone needs content that might help them sell internally versus where someone needs content that might be in order to support a user of the product. These complex dances were really interesting to us. The second insight is that customers come with questions, not requirements. And this is something that came consistently through all of our research groups and our conversations with customers. It's actually, what customers are really interested in is, how am I going to improve my business? Not necessarily, what have you got to sell? And so we have really changed and steered the steer for how we build the content strategy for the site. We started thinking much more about the types of questions that customers might have. What should I be doing about anti-money laundering? What do new regulations mean for my business? All these types of questions. And we started to build a whole layer of answers at the top of our website journey that would allow customers to self-identify their problems much more easily and then put our products and services into a relevant context as a solution to those challenges. So this was really important for us and changed the entire structure of the site to this kind of question-led approach. I'll pass back to Antonia.
Thanks. And just to add to that, actually, I mean, it was our hypothesis before that people kind of knew what they wanted by the time they came to the site. And what was revealing about it was that that was absolutely the case for some people. And so it was extremely important that for those people, they could get to that kind of information that they wanted really, really quickly. But a surprising number of people didn't quite know or they knew us for what they knew us for. So that they knew that we would provide these types of services, but when they had a different kind of problem, say a new piece of regulation, they didn't necessarily make the connection that the person who sells us this today could also sell us this to help with this. So it wasn't that they didn't know to come to us for a particular set of products, but they didn't know to come to us for a fuller range of products. And so we were missing opportunities to really showcase the breadth of how we could help the customer, which in turn helped them with their vendor rationalization and cost control and all that stuff that they also cared about. So this was quite an important finding for us. Lastly, building in this kind of emotional layer into thinking about our marketing and to really mapping out that customer experience really led to some quite surprising and eye-opening opportunities, and I'll give you an example. Unless you're a startup hedge fund, you've probably got something that does what we're selling you already. And what typically happens if you take, for example, our desktop, so we have a terminal that sits, and that is your access into our data and insights. And say we're knocking out a competitor like Bloomberg. What typically happens is we sell in against Bloomberg, we'll sell to a team of people that's usually fairly significant and large in a bank, and there's a 6-month crossover period where they're kind of coming out of Bloomberg and onto Thomson Reuters in this example. And there were 2 opportunities in there that kind of I guess if we'd really sat down and thought about it, we would have got to it, but it was kind of enlightening for it to come out of the process. Firstly, the person who is making the purchase decision, who isn't necessarily the person using it, at the point at which they started to deploy this new purchase that they've made up against a competitor, literally side by side on the desk, they suddenly moved from being surrounded by our salespeople, who are incredibly charming and really all over you if they want their commission check, to an implementation team, who are also excellent but are very, very different, and they see a very different side of Thomson Reuters, just at the point where they're at the biggest kind of trust moment, where they really need to trust us as a brand. The sales team go, and the implementation team come in. Now, neither of those teams are better or worse than each other, but the point is we're making a change at the point at which the customer is least ready for us to change the people who surround them. Now, but obviously, there is an opportunity for us to change that handoff. But what there definitely is an opportunity for us to do in a much shorter time horizon is to think about how can marketing help to cover that experience, right? How do we handhold the customer through that in a way that's scalable, that's personal, and that's meaningful at a point at which they are at their most concerned, even if they've been our biggest advocate through the buying process? Secondly, when somebody gets a new desktop on their desk and they've still got the competitive in, if you're doing a 6-month crossover, which is typical, we tend to shower them with welcome emails and all of the great stuff right at the very beginning, and then we kind of step back and let it happen. But actually, from having really looked at that emotional experience, what we realized was the day that they first got their new toy wasn't necessarily the day that they wanted to play with their new toy. And actually, it was as the deadline got closer and closer that the old thing was going away that they started to feel more invested in what the product was going to be and more concerned about the change. And that was not the point at which we were marketing to them the benefits of the new thing that they had. So it really, by taking this kind of more emotional kind of sort of lens to the actual experience of receiving our product in a way that we knew, our sales teams and our implementations teams knew it, it has really opened up some opportunities for us to surprise and delight and help our customers in a new way. And it was interesting when we got those people together in a room, people would say, oh yeah, we hadn't really thought about it like that. We hadn't really thought, as soon as we started to expose it, people were like, oh yeah, you're right actually. Now I come to think about it, I might feel like that too. And so that was a really good and enlightening moment. The second thing it enabled us to do is to say, okay, well, with a specific type of customer type, where we know about them and we know their kind of, what they're like, we know what their personality's like, we know how they're going to emotionally respond to our content, could we do better with that insight? And we took a sample set of a particular type of customer and ran them through a kind of tool that basically looks at various social kind of engagements that they have, looks at all sorts of things that they're allowed to, and categorizes them into certain sort of personality types. And we use that to inform the way that we write to that type of customer. So if they tended to be a kind of more aggressive, assertive, short attention span, we completely changed how we would present content to them to be much more short form, much more bullet-oriented, much more get to the point in terms of the product benefits. And we saw, it was very interesting because we saw the people who really loved it, and there were some people who really hated hated it and really hated it. But what it did do is it provoked a reaction. It was very, very different to the more neutral type of reaction that we were tending to get from some of our marketing activities. And lastly, we also used it to infuse some of our thought leadership. So we have a suite of risk products. They're designed to help banks to make sure that they don't lend money to people who are what they call politically exposed, and also to comply with regulation. And in our latest report, rather than sort of talking about that as a paradigm and talking about slavery and corruption and bribery and all of those things that all of our products help banks to help the world avoid, we led that against some really emotional stories of people who had been in those situations. So people who had been victims of slave trafficking, people who had been victims of government fraud. And that lent a really different emotional intensity to our marketing and actually provoked a very different type of response and frankly made it more interesting for everybody. So this emotional lens opens up really surprising opportunities and real opportunities for you to differentiate yourself, particularly if you're in a very competitive market where the margin of difference between you and competitors isn't always that large. So what's the recipes for success? We thought it'd be helpful to say, what were the factors that we thought made a difference and really helped us to do this? So firstly, I think whilst we wanted to do it anyway, having the trigger event of rewriting our entire website was kind of important. It was a galvanizing point for the whole of marketing, and something like a website, less than even an amazing proprietary event in London like this, website is kind of globally galvanizing, and everybody cares in the organization cares about the website. So it was a really good moment for us to A, rethink, and B, galvanize the organization behind what we were trying to do. Secondly, getting the right types of teams in. So we worked with people like technical account managers and some of the implementation teams that we don't typically work with in marketing, and actually they gave us some really, really great insights that really surprised and provoked us. So getting the right kind of teams together and sort of thinking a bit more laterally about that full end-to-end customer experience was important. If you don't want feedback, you shouldn't ask for it. But if you ask for it, you have to be prepared to get it. And some of the feedback that we got, particularly from customers, was both surprising and in some cases, if we were feeling more defensive about it, might have been a bit upsetting. We had people on some ways saying, I don't think you know how great your product is. You could really dial it up, and that felt really good. And in some ways, some people came back to us and said, it's disappointing that on the day which we sign a deal of something expensive with you, you email us as if we're just a random prospect. That's just disappointing, and it feels a bit average to us as an experience. So you have to kind of be prepared to kind of take that feedback on board and not be too precious about it. It takes a really long time to get this right. I'm sort of notoriously impatient, and Simon and Donna and others tell me that we've done this very, very quickly, but even for me, we had a great idea and we had a moment and we just really wanted to get on with it. But getting the right people together, getting the right process in place, really taking the time to get the right feedback from the right people takes some time. And so you have to do it at a point in your kind of marketing life cycle and your marketing year where you've actually got the proper time to dedicate to it. And I think you have to have the right mindset as a team as well. So there are some years where I don't think we could have done this. Some years where we're so aggressively chasing the growth target, or we're so aggressively chasing something very specific that it would not have been possible for us to have done it in one of those years. So I would say choose the year that you do it in carefully, and choose a year where you know that you're going to have the time to be able to breathe and do this really, really well. And lastly, choose the right partner. I mean, it's really, really not easy, and you need to work with a team of people who can take some pretty in-the-moment feedback. You need to work with people who understand what you're trying to achieve and who are really committed to helping you to get there. And because it's not easy, and like anything that's complicated and new, there are times when you're just fundamentally not going to agree with each other. And so you have to be able to have the right level of partnership to be able to get through that. Kind of a bit like a marriage. It's not great every day, but you have to kind of trust that it'll be great kind of more often than it's not. And so I guess just to sort of finish off, I would say that, just to summarize all of that, it's, we had the right destination. I had a good traveling companion. We had good traveling companions, actually, inside and outside Thomson Reuters. And we had a good kit bag of stuff. We have the right kind of website. We had the right skills. We had the right people. But it's still a really, really hard journey. But I think something that's incredibly transformative for us as a business, and so it's well worth it. So I would encourage you, if you have the opportunity and you have the right environment to do it, I would really encourage you to give it a go. Questions? Thank you.
That was absolutely fantastic presentation, and I just don't think it's any. I need to feel the urge to comment on the fact that it's still not often you have a CMO, albeit with an agency. Agencies are much better at this, coming on stage and talking about emotion in B2B, but also talking about it from a perspective of quite a logical, rational, and useful, measurable part of the buyer journey. And often you can talk about it from the big brand perspective. You talked about it as part of your the business of getting things done, and I think that's a really significant thing. Was that a difficult? Was the discussing emotion, was that difficult with your senior peers? Did you tell them it was emotional, or did you tell them it was about something else and
slip it in?
Slip it in, exactly.
Well, firstly, just to respond to the first thing you said, I think we're really good, particularly if you do good, interesting top-of-funnel content marketing, we're pretty good at using emotional hooks to get people engaged in that.
Sure.
And then I think we kind of become a bit more pedestrian and functional as you move through the buying cycle. And that's partly because the sales teams come in, it's partly because it's a longer relationship, but we all know we can do it, because I would imagine that most people in this room are doing that good top-of-funnel, exciting, like how do I stand out, capture people's imagination. We just don't think about it the whole way through. In terms of how did we talk to people internally about it, I guess we probably did slip in the emotional stuff, if I'm really honest about it. And actually, we started off by being quite practical. Why are people coming to us in the first place? What are they looking for? Then what happens? And then what do they do? And say they decide to buy, then what happens? So the first thing was to map out the actual functional relationship.
Yeah.
And then and you have to do that first anyway, because you have to know what you're talking about. And then you have to say, okay, well, at this point, is it good or bad? Like, what kind of feedback are we getting? What would people's concerns be at this point? Would people be happy or worried here? And so you can kind of guide people into it, because it's against something that they know very well. So I think that, to talk about emotions in a B2B context, I would definitely recommend that you start with something that people know very well, which typically is the process, the handoffs, and that kind of level of engagement. And then you can start to have a more nuanced conversation. But that's when the magic happens. And that's when you get even these kind of quite deeply analytical techie guys going, oh, I think I would feel a bit worried about that at that point. Never really thought about it. So, that's really where it starts to happen.
Sounds like a very exciting place to be. Do we have got time for a little of questions? If anyone's got a question for Antonia and Simon, please do raise your hand. We've got some people with microphones who will come to you. So please, there's a lady at the front here. Siobhan, are you, or Jenny's going to come down. Just very, did you find anything that really surprised you in your kind of discovery phase? Anything that really shocked you, or like really anecdotes you were, I didn't think that was going to happen?
Look, I'll let Simon speak too, but I think it surprised us how emotional it was, actually. I think we were expecting people to be like, we'd sign the contract, and then we know this happens, and we know that happens. But actually, the customers were quite open with us to say, actually, this is a bit disappointing. This is a point where we really care about this, and we didn't really feel like you showed up to that. Or this was a point where we really cared about it, and we picked up the phone, and you were amazing. And so actually, it was kind of weirdly easier to have emotional conversations with our customers than it was with our internal people.
So learning this.
I guess everyone's feeling it, though, aren't they?
Thank you. When you were talking about the development customer experience map, you were showing the feelings, like how customers felt. How did you measure that? How did you know how they feel?
Yeah, okay. So it was a combination of our own initial hypotheses. So where there were points of frustration, we were talking to a room full of people who deal with customers every day, who often receive that feedback themselves, and we were gauging the sort of highs and lows from that initial conversation. And then we were able to talk through that journey again with real customers. And to be honest with you, asking someone how they feel is usually a pretty bad idea if you want to gauge feelings. The better way to do it is to start to get them to talk about their experience and listen to the language they use, listen to the way they talk about it, and start to probe and question around that issue. So if somebody's talking a lot, actually, I agree. I think customers are really forthcoming, generally speaking, and people get pretty animated when they feel they've been stressed out, frustrated, delighted. They can usually remember that stuff. It's the peak end effect in action. So it was built that way, and until we get to a point where we can put sort of EEG scanners on everyone, that's probably the best way to do it.
So group therapy basically is the answer.
A lot of it was, yes.
So, any other questions? So Shane's got a question at the back. Could someone get as a microphone, a customized microphone on its way to you right now, which will be with you any second now. So great question, by the way, down at the front. Shane.
I was really interested about the dance, and I think that's fascinating in people changing who they're interacting with and the persona they take on. What I'm really interested to know is, as a result of that insight, did you change the journey, did you change the content, or did you change both?
I'll take a first run at it. So the first thing we tried to change was the content, because actually that was kind of more within our control. So thinking about, at this point at which, for example, a customer turns from being kind of the brutal guy who nailed you on the price to having to be your biggest advocate to try and persuade somebody to take a product that they've bought on your behalf. How did we give content into that moment to help that kind of chameleon effect of who they were having to be in that moment? And that was kind of more within our gift. It's kind of interesting what you're saying. Did we change the experience? I guess that's kind of making me think, no, we didn't, but perhaps we should. I'm kind of intrigued about that. I think that in some ways you're held to a kind of procurement process, so there's a limit to what you can do there, but potentially with a longer tail, you could look to change that and potentially use automation to do it, yeah.
I think that's a very good question, so thank you very much indeed. One last one over there. We can get a microphone over as quickly as possible. Whilst the microphone's coming over, perhaps I can just ask you, Simon, is this something, have you done anything like this? This sounds like a massive job. Was this, have you done, obviously Umabone are a fantastic agency, obviously, but have you done anything on this scale before? Was it a bit of wow, how are we going to do this?
Every job's a bit different, if I'm completely honest, and this had its own, I think one of the things about this job that made it quite interesting and challenging is the complexity of the business itself. Thomson Reuters isn't really one business, it's a bunch of different businesses, and you've got to kind of, with so many different types of buyer.
So proper B2B, it's interesting because it's complex. It's
yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, we like that.
Because it's hard.
Yeah. We don't want to be easy, we're in B2B, we don't like easy, do we? For God's sake. Vicky, last question.
Thanks, guys. It's Vicky from Marketo. I was just wondering whether you've used any specific metrics to measure the success of this.
So I think that we will do, but I think we're a bit early to be able to do that. And actually, I was thinking about it. It feels a bit like, oh, it's a journey rather than a whole load of it definitely worked at the end. So, but putting in place a new website with the personalization we've got attached to it and linking it with our marketing automation, it's going to take a bit of time for us to A, see the results, and B, really, really start to interrogate some of the thinking, because we're going to have to do A/B tests over a longish period of time. Certainly, we found when we started to flex the tone of voice, depending on the type of person, we did start to see results. But I think, and certainly things like, we're hoping we'll certainly be measuring things like the customer engagement monitor, how likelihood to recommend, all of that kind of stuff, and that's all in plan, but we tend to measure those every year. So that might be one that I need to come back in a year or so's time and tell you about what happened next.
Watch this space.
There we go.
Okay, so I think we've run a little bit into the break, but thank you very much indeed to Simon and Antonia. Fantastic presentation, really inspiring stuff, but thank you guys.